Today we're talking about managing content through snapshots and deciding which version of a question to present to a user. My name is Rich Shupe. I work in the New York office in support, and this is Andrew Morrison.
Yep, and I'm from the Sydney office, and I work behind the scenes on some of our internal applications.
So this is what we're going to be going over. We're going to be preparing some dishes for you. The aperitif is dynamic content, where we are presenting versions of the content that will be customized each time an assessment is initialized. And the entree will be item banks. We'll take a look at managing item banks, multiple item banks, pulling content from different item banks. The salad course, Andrew?
While the salad's being prepared, I'll introduce you to the kitchen staff. That is the back office process that handles our long-running jobs. That will lead into the main course, that is item pools, which are the content snapshots.
And then for dessert, we'll take a look at that concept of being able to control which version of a question is presented to the user. You may want to make an edit, and you may want to present the original question seen versus a newly edited or corrected version. We'll go over that. And then, of course, we'll end with a brief Q&A. So let's take a little bit of an intro on what dynamic content is. Essentially, it's smart content that will present a unique version of a question each time an assessment is initialized. So in our metaphor here, we're mixing up the ingredients every time. We're thinking about labs in which people can look over the shoulders of other users, being able to give you the same type of question with a pool of data that you can pull from and present that in a unique way each time a student is faced with the content. And if you've tried to experiment with this before, if you've read about this on the documentation site and have not had access, this feature must be enabled. It's really simple to do if you use the author API. It's a simple configuration option, and if you're using the Learnosity hosted author site, you can let us know, and one of the Learnosity chefs will prepare that for you. And so as you can see here in this little code snippet, this is what it looks like in the author API initialization. You simply set dynamic content to true, and then we'll take a look at some of the UI elements that will appear. I'm just going to run through this quickly because I'll do this live for you. But essentially what we're talking about is presenting a comma-delimited list of data that you can use in a way that will introduce this data as variables within a question. Raise your hand if you've ever done a mail merge or anything like that in Word or a database. It's very similar. We're going to be creating a variable, putting that variable into the question, and then each time the question is presented, it'll pull from this comma-delimited set of data and present new content for you. In fact, if we have time during the Q&A session, I'll just show you a couple of quick examples of how you can even use external applications to generate that data for you, like Excel or Google Sheets, and we'll make that available in the after session stuff that you can download as well. So once you put in that data, you'll create a table. You can preview the content. You'll see by variable name. You'll see all the different rows of data that you've put in. We can accommodate up to 1,000 rows of data. So that you can have a large pool of information that can be used each time the question is initialized. And then here's a quick snapshot of the editing interface. This is the editing of a question. This happens to be a math fill in the blank, but you can use the data in a wide variety of question types. The data input, or the entry of the data into the question comes from the rich text editor. So as you can see, the highlighted area here, we're pulling down a menu, choosing from one of the available variables that we've put into the data information. This data is available at the item level, so everything will be available to any question in that item. You could see, just quickly, you can see how the variables start to play a part in the stimulus there, and perhaps down here in the validation value, and we'll, of course, look at this live. Here's an example of where it appears at the item level. You'll see a little data button available. This is where you click on this button to enter in the data, and we'll take a look at doing this live. So here's the author site as an example. Many of you have used this or are familiar with this. So what we're going to do is just create a new item, and when you go to the item, you'll see the data button available because this is enabled in our demos organization here in the author site. So here's the data button itself. So this is where you can paste in your content. You can pull this in from a CSV or write it dynamically. So just really quickly, we'll start with var1, var2, and let's say sum. And then we can put in data like 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 9, I don't know, 7, 3, 10, that kind of thing. And so you're building a relationship between the data you're putting in, how you're going to be using that into your question. So once you confirm that data entry, you'll see the table preview. You can take a look at each of the variables, preview the data. Longer sets of data will obviously be scrollable. You can preview everything you've put in, and you can apply that, and now this data is available to any question that appears inside this item. That's an important concept because the data is item specific, which means that you can have multiple questions that use this technique, as I said before, and it also means that this is not a system that we have introduced to generate an entire assessment of algorithmic data. This is question or item specific rather instead of being able to do so to automatically generate a 50 question assessment this way. So once we have the data available, we can add a question type. I'll just throw in a quick multiple choice because we'll show you some of the math questions we've already created. And let's just add something into the stimulus, and we'll say something like, what is the sum of these two numbers? And then we can add something like variable 1 here in the data input, and then plus variable 2. And then here in the multiple choice, we could put in, as an example, in our first answer, we could put in the sum from the data table. Where's our data here? And then we can put in some other distractors here just for the heck of it. This is a quick and dirty example that we're doing here. So you'll want to be aware of any kind of duplication that you'll see in your data. So obviously you could put variables in all of the distractors, which is what I would have done had I wanted to discuss this idea of duplication among distractors. So you could put in your data field knowing full well during that row that there will never be a duplication in any of your distractors. So you can see the information appearing here on the right, and I think I entered 3 or 4 rows of data, and what you can see is in the preview mode here, as you walk through, you'll see the data swapping, and you'll see the factors or the numbers that we're summing here appear different each time you walk through, simulating the reinitialization for each individual student. And then you'll see the sum changing here in the first distractor. And so the idea is that you can build an extensive number of rows, introduce all this data, and have each time the assessment is initialized, have each student see different content. And to demonstrate that, we have an example of 3 assessments, 3 copies of the same assessment being delivered at once. And so you'll see here as I start each of these assessments, this is our proctoring example, our live progress report. And you'll see these assessments are all coming up, and they're each one delivering the same question, and yet the data is different. So here again is a situation where you're in a lab and you have people looking over students' shoulders and they can't copy content or answers from each other. And as you walk through, there are 2 or 3 questions in each of these, and you'll see that data differs each time. And so this is just a simple way to go through the process of demoing the process of the dynamic content. And once I wanted to go through the simple example in multiple choice, I want to show you quickly the idea of having generated this for a math question. So we'll take a look at something that we've already done. The content, in fact, that you saw in the proctoring demo there. And so what we see here is we'll take a look at the data first, and you'll see a large number of rows for our demo, maybe 20, 25 rows. And you'll see in this case there are multiple names in use, chef 1, chef 2, the ingredient in question, how many are needed, how many are in hand, and how many must be contributed from that second chef. And then when we start to work with each of these questions, you'll see that as the data is entered in by variable, chef 1, needs a certain number of a particular ingredient, but has only a certain number in hand. How many must chef 2 contribute? So here you see walking through that data, Jim needs 2 kiwis, but has 0. How many kiwis must Chef Ben contribute? And as you walk through, you'll see that appearing. And you can, as we discussed earlier, you can put the data in the validation object as well. So the answer is being pulled from a row to match the numbers that have been put into the stimulus or distractors. So that's just a quick demo on how to generate the dynamic content. And you'll see that in action as we go through. We'll revisit this a little bit later. And what we want to talk about now is how to pull that content from multiple item banks. So the idea is when you start working with Learnosity as a customer, you have an item bank associated with you. Your consumer has an item bank. So a typical setup would be you, with the consumer, will have your own item bank, but you may also, for example, you might have multiple item banks. So for example, you might license an item bank from a provider, an item bank provider. So in that case, you might have two item banks. And in this way, you'll need to be able to determine how to pull the content you're interested in from one of those particular item banks. Or you may also have access from one consumer to another. You may have separate consumers set up for particular reasons, or you might have a partnership working with another Learnosity customer. So if granting permission, if that permission has been granted to you, you may be able to reach out of your consumer into another and access another item bank as well. And to do this is actually a really simple process. We're just going to assign a new property called organization ID, and that will specify which organization you want to pull the content from. So let's take a look at some simple code snippets. The first example is what you're probably used to if you're working with the items API at the moment. The items array is simply an array of strings. These are the item references coming from your default item bank. But again, let's say that you have two item banks, and in this case, you want to pull from another that is not your default. In that same generic scenario where you're providing an array of items, you simply add an organization ID to that request object, and now all of those items, here again, item 1 and item 2, will be pulled from that second item bank. Now again, the permission must be granted for you to do that. You will be provided an organization ID for this purpose, so we'll say, for that particular organization, use 75. You'll then put in organization ID 75, and that content will be pulled from that item bank. But there's a third scenario where you may want to pull some items from one item bank and yet other items from a secondary item bank. And to do that, we've introduced another form of the items array. Instead of being a solitary string, which is the item reference, we now have an object, and that object in its default form simply allows you to assign an ID to that reference, which allows you to have duplication of references. If you imagine in an items array, you can't have item 1, item 1, item 1. So what happens if that item is named item 1 in both of your item banks? So we allow you to do that by assigning the item ID. So you can specify ID 1, item 1, ID 2, item 1, ID 3, item 1, because you're pulling them each from separate item banks. So in the first case you see here, we're pulling from the default item bank because we specified no organization ID. And in the second example, we have the same item coming from an alternate item bank. And actually, I'll have to modify this. My ID is the same here. So this would be item 2 here. So we're pulling item 1 from each of these, this one coming from your default, and the second one coming from the organization ID specified in the object. So that gives you an idea of how you can pull content from the item bank of your choice. Again, you must have permission to access that item bank, but it gives you the chance to build assessments of varying complexity. And we're going to switch over to Chef Andrew in a moment, and we thought we'd take a little break and give away a prize. And running with this metaphor, if there's anything Andrew and I do well, it's beating a metaphor to death. So does anyone have any idea what's behind some of the world's best sauces, gravies, or stews? A very good roux. So let's pass that along. Excellent. Hit him up. Very good. In fact, I'll do that. So we'll switch over to Chef Andrew. Thank you.
So I did mention that today's main dish is the veritable feast. How am I doing with the mic here? That is item pools. But first, before I get there, I need to introduce you to the kitchen staff, and that is our back office processes, stateful back office processes, called the long-running job services. Now, these guys are our automated migrators. As we like to think of them, they're our grumpy cooks. Now, most data API use that most of you might be familiar with are short-lived requests, as in you'll hit it up, you'll get a response straight away. What these guys deal with is requests with a bit more meat. They handle the processes that need just a little bit more cooking. They perform the tasks that need a little bit more secret sauce, and most importantly, they bear the burden of me completely killing this analogy. So this should look familiar. If you've used Data API before, as a client, you hit up the headless API, which is Data API, with a request. Now, if this was just your normal fast food request, you'd get an immediate response back. But if it's one of these long-running processes, what Data API is going to do is hand that across to our job service. Now, like most good kitchen staff, they're usually backed up. If it's a popular restaurant, there's going to be a ticketing system in place, which means that you as the client, the person waiting for your content to be dealt with in a timely manner, just have to wait. So what happens from there is the kitchen staff pick them up. We have many, many, many different types of long-running jobs. Some of them don't necessarily even use Data API. The original job service jobs came from other restaurants, things like adaptive simulations from the author site, porter services from the porter site. But for today, we really only care about our asynchronous Data API long-running jobs, including today's chef special, which is item pools. Now, while that's kicked off and while the kitchen staff are preparing it, if you ever need to see what's going on, because for the time being, that job's being worked on, it's going to get done. You don't need to worry about that so much. But if you want to keep tabs on it, if you want to know, hey, if it's cooked, did they leave it in too long, did it get burnt, were the ingredients bad, you have to do an alternate request to get jobs. So while that may seem like a bit of a roundabout issue, we only really care about the green section here. As a client, you make your normal short-lived request to Data API to kick things off. And then later on, when you want to see the results of what's going on, you hit Data API again with a different endpoint, that is get jobs. Whoop. All right. Now, because Data API itself is a headless API, I put together a few of our these demos just so you can see what's going on. So what's going to happen here on the left, this is an item pool request. Don't worry too much about the specifics right now because I will get into that later. We're going to hit the Data API with a request to the correct endpoint for item bank pools. And then after this pull request is done, we're going to see a response that represents that short-lived request, where it's going to say, hey, you don't get an immediate response back on this particular request. We're going to give you back what's called a job reference. So once again, our meaningful headless Data API just coded response. So we just said, hey, let's make an item pool called today's special menu item 1. We just got back our job reference. Now, I've set up a little background job just to poll the job service. The code for doing this kind of thing from UI, along with what Rich said, we're going to kind of distribute it at the end. They're just kind of very simple demos. As you can see, I'm literally just running it off my local host. Now we hit the jobs endpoint to get jobs, and we see that we actually get a response. Now, we created something called an item pool. We'll get into what that represents later. What this result is from the jobs endpoint is just a job result. Now, because once again, this is the very limitedly formatted Data API result, I'll go back to something a bit cleaner. So what's typical in a job response is your job reference. I have this incorrect little thing here. Typically, a job reference will be assigned. It's not something that you can assign yourself. For our uniqueness, every time a job gets thrown through the system, it will give you a unique ID. Following that is the job type. In this particular case, I kicked off an item pool job. When you start listing things, if you're running multiple jobs, and there's plenty of them, once you get familiar with the job service, you can start organizing it by things like type. In this particular case, it's item pool, but there is at least a dozen different back office job types that can go through. Following that is a status. Now, this is very important to pay attention to. Because these are long-running jobs, you're waiting for it to complete, but at some point it might be held up along the way. So one of the results you might see is halted. Now, when halted comes into play, typically with the Data API asynchronous jobs, those processes will dump why the job was halted into the results array. Whoop. But typically when one of those asynchronous jobs is completed, you aren't going to see that populated at all. So the takeaway on jobs is we use the jobs endpoint for Data API. No one can actually create a job directly. It's always kicked off by a request to do something that's going to take a bit longer. It has a cooking process. All jobs start as queued because there is a system in place. Then they move on to running. Sometimes you might see a job run for quite a long time. I mentioned adaptive simulations. With a simulation with 10,000 users, they can run for a very, very significant amount of time. And finally, they'll end up being either completed or halted. Once again, halted jobs put content or process errors in the results object. And this is all accessible by polling the job via Data API. Now, there is one differentiation here that I'll add at the very end, and that is if you try to kick off a long-running process and your actual request to Data API is bad, that's not something that reaches the job service, and that's something that Data API will validate for you and give you instant feedback for why your request was bad. We'll get into a few of those later with dealing with item pools. So, item pools. Today's special. This is kind of where the analogy starts falling down when you're talking about copying digital content. Its application to real-world food items starts falling down entirely. So, just to answer what is an item pool is a snapshot of defined item bank content. Now, this content, once it's in a pool, it cannot be edited or modified with any of our authoring tools. So, as far as assessments are concerned, it is immutable. However, they can be updated and modified very explicitly with another request to the item pool service. And content used for the initial snapshot and any updates must always come from an item bank. So we're always using pre-authored content because the whole point is it's a snapshot. So just as a quick example, we have here our item bank, and in it we have a very nice tasty item with a very nice recipe for cake. Now we want to preserve that as it is. So let's say we're in the summertime, we're authoring content for spring. When the fall semester. When the fall semester comes into play and the aspiring chefs are now following this recipe, we can now start modifying what's in our item bank. Now we decide, hey, we don't want egg anymore, it's old hat. If we want to preserve that again, we can create another item pool. So now we're running with 3 completely different snapshots of what is essentially the same item. And that can continue on as much as you like. So you can come up with a very, very weird, almost pasta-like cake, and continue on from there. So why would you want to use an item pool anyway? This is all about preserving content. So if you need to preserve an assessment from your summer authoring session into the fall, and then work on that assessment during the fall assessment period, there you go. You've got it safely tucked away, immutable from the assessment context. Another alternate use that we don't see a lot of use with people using currently, but actually seems quite useful, is organizing your assessment or your items by category. So for instance, let's say you've gone through, you've got an exquisite tagging system in place, you've got a whole bunch of math questions, you've got a whole bunch of English questions, and you want to start preserving all your math questions separately, your English questions separately. You can actually start creating pools by tags. That means you don't actually have to search through all your items. There's a whole different number of ways that you can create your item pools. So one of the things that we try to get people to avoid, we're not too prescriptive about how people need to use item pools in particular, because at the end of the day, it's just another workflow tool for authoring. It's snapshotting your entire item bank over and over again for every single change. While this is a possible thing you can do, and hey, you might want or need to do it, it is something that we recommend trying to avoid because it represents perhaps something workflow related that might need to be addressed earlier than snapshotting everything over and over again. So, once again, using the Data API, it's a headless service. I put together this nice little wizard to start creating our item pool content. Now, Rich was good enough to actually create me some content to start using. So I'm going to start cooking. I actually have a mouse. All right. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to try and create just a pool of these two items. And I'm going to give it a nice little name. All right, so the endpoint we're hitting is itembank pools. I should have actually listed it up here, and I will correct that in the demo that we released at the end. This is kind of what you expect when you're looking at creating a pull request. Now, most of this is already documented on docs, but I'm just going to run through it briefly just so you guys have an idea. Pools need content. So everything that goes into a pool is wrapped in this content array. Now, depending on what you're putting into the pool, you can specify activities, you can specify items, you can specify questions, you can specify tags. So that's why this builder has started organizing this for us. Outside of the content is all the config related to the pool. All pools require a reference because you need some way to reference what pool you're pulling from when you're using the content. So we're going to go and submit this, see what happens. Now, I mentioned earlier that if there is a problem with your request, the actual request to Data API, before any of the long-running job services can come into play, Data API will catch that for you. So in order to actually create a pool, this is in the docs. This is just a very small example. For pools, you actually need to name it a nice human-readable name. So let's try that again. All right. Once again, this pool already exists. I did mention that for the sake of assessment, pools are immutable, which means that every single time you try to overwrite things, you'll be picked up along the way. And that means anytime you need to overwrite something like a pool or make changes, you need to be very explicit about changing any content in there. So one of the pool config options we have is overwrite. So it starts adding all our config to the request. And away we go. Now, this is familiar with when I sent off a request to the item pool service before and got a job reference. We're now, once again, checking the job reference in the background. And lo and behold, our job was halted. This time we see a result. We get to know that there was a process error. We attempted to create a pool with unpublished content. There's very good reason unpublished content can't go into pools, and that is because the unpublished content, trying to use it in an assessment will actually cause the assessment to error out, which means that if you're being very deliberate about what you're trying to preserve, doing it in an unpublished state for use as a pool just doesn't make any sense. That being said, there are ways to get that content in there. We have an option called set unpublished to published. So once again, the config got added to our request there. You got it, buddy. All right, once again, we get a job reference back. We check the job in the background, and lo and behold, our item pool was created. Now, what I'm going to do is I've put in another background request in here. It's called check item pool items. So what it's going to do is it's going to use this reference, and it's going to pull Data API as per normal. So let's say you wanted to get items out of Data API. You'd be hitting itembank items. And in this particular instance, we're going to add what's called an item pool ID, which is the pool reference we use to create the pool. And those are the two items we managed to put in there. One final thing I will do is attempt to update our pool. So I'm going to get rid of our config. This time I'm going to add a few of the extra references that we have. Whoop. And we don't need to use this name anymore because the pool already exists. So what we're saying is for this particular item pool reference, we're going to put this additional content in there. So away we go. And once again, get a job reference back. Now, this time the pool was halted again. It's saying that an existing reference was found. This particular item up here, I accidentally left it behind. Once again, this is another reiteration of the fact that the whole point of pools is to be immutable, and every time you want to overwrite things, you need to be very explicit. So once again, if I need to replace this, I can use the overwrite flag, and it will use what's ever in the live item bank and push that back into the pool, which means you can actually start updating content on purpose. So I'm going to remove this for now, and I'm going to submit it again. And because these two are new items, it should go through smoothly. Bada bing, bada boom. All right. So that's more or less the system in place to create pools and some of the config options you'll need to set for the different scenarios. So once again, we'll take a break between myself and Rich, and we'll return to our budding chefs in the room and to see who knows how many tablespoons are in a quarter cup.
Very good.
Straight away. All right.
Excuse me. Very, very nice. Okay, thank you, Andrew. And we want to hit on two very simple things. The idea here that with multiple item bank sources, you can also invoke pools now that we know how to create them. So we can protect ourselves again with the idea of taking a snapshot of the content, making our live assessment pull from the item pool instead of the live item bank, which means that we can now go into that live item bank and make changes without affecting any of the assessments that are already out there in the wild. So here again, you can pull from an item pool that you've created in your own organization, and if you have permission to access other item bank sources, you can also reference an item pool in another organization. Just a real quick look at the snapshot. This is just revisiting the same slide. You'll see that now, even in the simplest use of items API, we're simply adding an item pool ID. So we're pulling the simple item 1, item 2 from our default org using that pool. We can pull the entire assessment from another organization, and then of course we can still specify item specific so that we can get one item from our default org and perhaps another item from another org and even from an item pool in that org. So we're just adding one more property, which is the item pool ID. All right, so the last thing we want to talk about is the idea of controlling which form of a question that your user has seen. And the common scenario here is that you put an assessment out, students begin taking that assessment, perhaps they find an error in one of the questions, and you need to correct that error before it reaches other students. Perhaps you have an SLA mandate to correct that error within a specific time period. So you need to be able to make a rapid change that's not something you're going to be revisiting at the start of the next semester. So the idea behind this is you now have perhaps one student who has seen the errant question and has chosen a specific answer based on that version of the question. You've now made a correction, and you have other students yet to take the assessment. So what we've now introduced is a new property called render with captured questions. And there's a simple idea here that in order to make saves and submits faster, more performant, we don't actually submit all of the data every single time there's a save or submit. What we do instead is at the time of initialization, we capture all the question data. And then from that point forward, we only send deltas. So only the changes made to the questions or responses get sent in. It makes it much faster, much more reliable, much more performant. So the idea that offers us is that because that captured version of the question exists, we can choose to present to the user that original captured version or the current version that's live in the item bank. So what we're going to do is take a look at how that might work. And a simple use case would be, as I mentioned earlier, you have a student who has already started an assessment, they've already answered this question, they've already chosen a response based on the original form of the question, and that student perhaps is resuming the assessment at a later time. and then you have another set of students who are seeing that assessment for the first time. So in an ideal world, we should be able to present the original form seen by the student that's already taken the assessment. So when they resume that assessment, we offer the original form. But if the student has not yet taken the assessment, we obviously want to give the most current, updated, corrected version of the content. So in the top, we have default initialization that you might have seen many times before. And because this is a new student or a new assessment for the student, and the state is initial, we don't want to take any non-default actions. We want to offer the most current, up-to-date content that is in the item bank at the moment. And down below that, an excerpt of that same request object. This is the student that has already seen the question and is already wants to see that same question. They need context and so on for seeing the question before, during resume. So again, sorry, that's the second state should say resume. I'll correct that again as well. So when the state is being offered as a resume, we're going to show the original form, and when it's a brand new assessment, we're going to show the new form. So I can show you a demo of this. In this particular case, we have a question. This is an initial assessment, and actually I want to edit this question for you, so let's take a look at the authoring environment first. Let's add a tab here, and I'll show you what the question looks like at the moment. So we're going to search the tags that the content that we've been creating for our pools examples. We're going to search for our content we have persisted here, and we're going to take a look at this multiple choice question. And in the current form of this multiple choice question, it's a simple question. Rich and Andrew are on the cusp of landing a lucrative multinational cookbook and broadcasting deal. Will they leave Learnosity behind? And we have two options. We have the classic 8-ball approach, the magic 8-ball approach, reply hazy, try again. And another one, neither have plans to seek work of any kind outside the warm and comfortable womb that is Learnosity. Now, when presented with this original form of the question, clearly the answer is that we're warm and comfortable. So the student may see this, and you'll see, for example, when they resume that assessment, you want to see the original form of that question. But at the same time, it's possible to edit this content. And let's see, do we have can we open up, Andrew, the text document with our editable content? Do you know where that is? Okay. All right, so now what we have here is the second form of this question. And we're going to alter these responses. So we're going to edit this question. And in the first response, we're going to put in another approach here. Andrew has successfully negotiated terms that are slanted significantly in favor of the on-air talent, allowing the pair to shoot several shows a day on periodic weekends. And as a result, as such, this will not interfere with their dedication to the cause of improving educational software worldwide. They plan on happily staying where they are and sharing their newfound success with all of the other members of the Learnosity family. That's very obviously what we would do. The alternate answer is, sadly, yes, they will be leaving Learnosity to pursue their newfound success. And once we look at this change, you'll see that the context seen by the original student is completely reversed. Now we have, instead of staying with the warm and comfortable womb, we are now leaving to enjoy our success. So the context is completely lost for the student. So here in a new initial assessment, let's reinitialize this to make sure that update is reflected. Because we're not resuming this assessment, the new updated item bank content will be shown to that new student, that new form. So it gives you a chance to present to the user a version of the question that is best suited to your needs. Having seen it, let's show the original. Having come to this assessment anew, let's show the most current updated item bank content. So that property allows you to pick and choose what you show and when. And that's the last major element we have. We have one final question. While boning a Poulard demi dessaucé, who famously said, "Now I've done it, I've cut the dickens out of my finger"? Sorry? or Dan Aykroyd as Julia Child. That's correct. Very good. So that's the last prize. Here you go.